right, welcome. Welcome to the 2023 Seed Savers Exchange Apple Grafting Workshop Series. You are in the first session of this workshop entitled How to Bench Graft. So today we'll be starting off by showing you how we collected scion wood from our orchard here at Seed Savers Exchange Farm, and how you could do the same if you have an old apple tree that you'd like to save or propagate. I will be introducing you to our orchard advisor, Lindsay Lee, who will walk you through the steps of bench grafting. And at the end of Lindsay's presentation, we'll use any remaining time for any questions that you have before the session is over. A couple of notes quick. Please note that this session is being recorded. And also importantly, please note that the knives we sent out are sharp and there is an inherent risk in using a knife. We recommend not opening them until you've received full instruction. You will have more individual help in the small group knife coaching sessions that you signed up for. Also, please note that if you do open them and you do cut yourself, it will be up to you to assess the situation and seek medical help if needed. Please don't cut yourself, but if you do, please apply pressure and get help if you need it. We're not able to assess that over Zoom, whether you can, whether you need medical help. We will record the sessions and the recording will be available to you next week. And we'll also be able to answer questions via email should they come up at a later date.
I'm sorry.
With that being said, I think we're ready to get started. So thanks again for everyone for being here. I'm going to start off by showing a short video about scion collection. And while I'm getting that video ready, I'm actually going to put up a poll. Let's see if you can see that. So if you want to just click yes or no to these two, I'm curious how many of you have grafted before and how many of you have an apple tree that's special to you that you might want to propagate.
So I'm out here in the orchard today and we're going to collect scion wood. That's the grafting material off of this tree, so we get a copy of the same tree. It's late February today. This is kind of the time frame. The wood has to still be dormant to do this grafting properly. So in Iowa here we do it February, March, sometimes into April. The critical part is you have to have a few weeks for the graft union to heal a little bit before you plant it out in the garden, and that's going to be around your frost-free date, so you can work back from there. Okay, I'm standing here in a rather old tree, and I want to show you some different parts of the tree. If you look up here, I've got a stem that is it's old growth. There's flower buds all over it, and there's very little new growth. We have to do our grafting with young, new growth. So there's nothing on this branch that would help us. Now, on an old tree like this, I often look back in the middle of it, and here I find a shoot that's vigorous and upright. Some people call them sucker shoots or water shoots. This one actually has a couple years growth on it. And I'll show you that. It came from this part of the tree. Here's actually 3-year-old wood. It's got spurs on it, and those hold flower buds, and we do not want our new graft to sprout out with flowers. We want leaves. Here's another section of new growth from last year. Well, it'd be from 2 years ago. And now here, I'm going to take this off. Right here is last year's terminal bud scar, and this shoot came out last summer, and that's what we want. It's brighter red. Sometimes they're yellowish, but often reddish. It's smooth, kind of glossy, and out toward the tip a little bit fuzzy growth. So that's what I'm looking for. Now, the size of the wood I want is determined a little bit by the rootstock I'm going to put this on, and it's really wonderful to match the diameter of your rootstock with the diameter of the scion wood. You can use scion wood that's smaller than your rootstock, but you can't use scion wood that's larger than your rootstock. for this workshop coming up, you're going to have rootstocks that are measured at 1/4 inch. So I'm going to take this whole cutting here, and I can make a new tree out of every 2-inch section of this. But just so I can store it easily, I'm going to cut it in half. And I'm going to put these in a plastic bag wrapped in damp, not wet, but damp paper towel. And I can store this in the refrigerator anywhere a few degrees above freezing, you know, like 34 to 42, something like that is wonderful for it, and I can store it for weeks that way.
All right, so that was a brief overview of what it means to collect scion wood. And this is something that any of you could do if you have an apple tree that is special to you that you'd like to propagate. Before I introduce you to Lindsay, I want to introduce you to 2 other people who collected all of the scion wood that you received in the mail if you ordered a rootstock and scion kit. First, we have Jamie Hansen, our orchard manager. Jamie, could you say hello?
Hi, yeah, I'm Jamie. I'm the orchard manager here at Seed Savers Exchange. We have some really cool varieties we sent out to you this year, and Jeanine sent to your email all of the descriptions for those if you want to learn a little bit more about what we sent out this year.
Thanks, Jamie. And we also have Zach, our assistant orchard manager. Zach, could you say hello?
Hello, I'm Zach, the assistant orchard manager, and yeah, I'm just super stoked to see so many people turn out for this. I'm really excited for it.
Thank you, Zach. Together, these 2 collected over 2,000 pieces of practice wood and scion for you all to have for this class. So thanks very much for all of that. Let's see, they also are going to be 2 of our grafting coaches in the small group session, so you might see them again. And now it is time for me to introduce you to Seed Savers Exchange Orchard and Horticultural Advisor, Lindsay Lee. Lindsay was actually Seed Savers graft team leader in 1989 when we first planted trees here at our heritage orchard, and he's been connected to Seed Savers and our orchards here ever since. So Lindsay, thanks so much for being here. Let me hand it over to you.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to work with this group of people. It's fascinating to me. We used to teach this in person here and teach over 3 days, 60 people. So the opportunity to contact this many people, you know, in the hundreds across the nation is quite an opportunity. I strongly believe that grafting is something that used to be commonly known, commonly held knowledge on the landscape, and I'm kind of on a mission to bring that back. I think that the ability to create new trees and share them with our friends and neighbors is just a really special process, and it doesn't take a lot of knowledge. So I did, in relation to this last little video, I brought a couple extra pieces that I collected this morning. I'm going to stand up so you can see them a little better. This is a shoot from a tree that I just cut this morning, and there's a transition point. This again, this above this great big bud is a little collar, and that's where this last season's growth started. Behind that, right here, this big fat bud is a flower bud, along with these farther down, and you can see the difference. Those flower buds are fat. I always say they're almost pregnant, and which literally they are. Above this collar, these buds are tight held tight to the stem. They don't stick out as far. That's what we're after. Those are going to produce leaves next, once they grow this spring, and that's what we're after. So this one, I think you might be able to see that. This is where that terminal bud, they would have been like this. So And here, see how that flower bud sticks up? This one too. But above this, no, this is new growth. This is what we want. That's from that, this is what grew last year, okay? Otherwise, my other message to you as we go into this is that you're, this is a learned skill. It has to do with our ability to handle a knife and understand the systems of the plant growth, but mostly it's what I call live carpentry. And if we pay attention and do a clean cut, we're going to have success with it. So with that, let's go on to some instructional video. We're ready to make our graft union. This is a piece of cyanwood that came in your kit. Look at the buds. They're triangular in shape and they should point up. It's very important. If we put this on upside down, it won't grow. So those buds have to be pointing away from the rootstock. This is your grafting knife, and it's a very sharp implement. And I'm going to teach you how to use it where it would be really hard to cut yourself. That's something we really want to avoid today. It has a flat side and a beveled side. The flat side should be facing you as if you're looking in a hand mirror. I'm going to put my thumb right against the blade. From the side, that's not ever going to cut me. No matter how, it's when I move back and forth against that blade that I'll cut myself. We've provided in your kit a little thumb cot that's a protector. It's not absolute, but it'll help prevent cuts. I find that when I do a lot of this, I whittle away at my thumb a little bit. So this would be nice to keep a little skin left on. Okay, so to make the cut, keep your elbows fastened to your body. The less we have movement in our hands, the more accurate we'll be. If I do this work out away from my body, I have less control. There's more movement. Right up here, I have the most control and the most power that I can put into this cut. So to make it, put your thumb here. Now put the cyanwood in between the thumb and the knife. I tilt the knife a little bit and then angle it. The angle there is going to determine the angle you go through the wood. Now, the trick is, don't move your dominant hand that's holding the knife. Move the hand that's holding the cyanwood. Okay? Now I just pulled a little bark off there. I might put the knife at a little more angle and a little more force with my thumb and pull that wood through. And look, all my thumb is doing is coming in to rest against the side of the blade. Now, common mistakes, if you're afraid of that blade and you don't put your thumb there, you're going to get a little tongue on the end of this. That's not good. That is too thin. I really want a flat surface all the way to the tip. And I want a flat surface this way too. If we've whittled away at it and we have something that looks like a potato chip, it's not going to come in good contact with the rootstock. So we want very flat surfaces. We also want them to be 3 times the diameter of the wood long. You see that? This is just a scrap of cyanwood, and this is at least 3 times the diameter, and it can be more than, shouldn't be less. The reason being is when we fasten this to the rootstock, we wrap tape around it, and we want it to pull them together. If I have too sharp an angle, it'll push them apart. You'll see that later. Okay, this is a good cut. The next thing is to cut the rootstock. the diameters, the whip and tongue graft is used on rootstock and scionwoods that match in diameter. So you see here, I'm a good 10 inches up from the root, and that's okay, but right in here I'm going to make my cut on the rootstock. That's a little short, not a problem. If I just come back here and peel away at the heel and do a little whittling, I can end up with a nice, flat, even taper. So I've got those both the same length, and we judged them to be the same width to begin with, so I think they're gonna fit together quite nicely. We can be a little bit undersized with the scionwood. We cannot be oversized with it. If it hangs out the edges, it won't take. The next thing, we call this a whip and tongue graft. The next step is the tongue cut. What I do for this, I set this on the table for this maneuver, and I use my knife to visualize center. Then I move back about 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 even, and I like to just wiggle the knife and apply some sideways pressure. Now this is counterintuitive to a lot of people because look, my fingers are here and I'm pushing that way. So be careful, push a little pressure, and then when you're in a ways, pull that up and open this cut. Can you see that from the side? It's ready to receive its pairing. So we do the same thing on the rootstock. I find center, I move out a little bit. And I'm trying here not to split with the grain. I am cutting back into the wood. So I've got 2 tongue cuts made opposite each other. I can fit those together, push them together, and there we have a graft union that will grow together. The more closely these fit, the more closely they align, the higher percentage of take you're going to have. So practice a little bit, use up that practice wood we sent along, get good at this cut, and you'll be able to make graft unions with the pros. The next step is to wrap it. In your kit, some of this tape came. This is a stretchy, paraffin-based, wax-based tape. And you simply hold it on your rootstock with a finger, stretch it, and once it's trapped, once you've gone once around, you can really stretch this out and wrap and pull that really tight. Once I've gone over the whole graft, I turn it around, come back down. And before you're done, before you lose a little bit to work with, I pull it tight and rip the end off. What that does is seals it against itself. It's waxy, so it kind of sticks to itself. Now, I've got a bud here and a bud here. I don't need more than that on there, so I'm going to take that off. Cut it just, 1/8, 1/4 inch above the top bud. When these start to grow, there's even one here, 2, 3 buds on there. That's plenty. You're going to end up choosing one of them. But there you have a whip and tongue graft. Now, we're going to go on. Maybe I have rootstock or scionwood that's too small for the rootstock I have. So here I have a nice big fat rootstock. There's a couple little twigs on there. And for this, so there's no place on here where I can line this up that the two are the same size. So I'm going to choose the place I want to put it. That's up about 8-10 inches from the root. And I cut that off square. Next, I'm going to make the cut on the, well, I'm going to make the cut on the scion first because I need to know how long it is. Okay, so here we go. See, I didn't have pressure behind here, so I have a tail. I take that off. Let's make one more. Oh. Yeah, nice and flat. Okay, this one I still make a tongue cut. Open it up. Now, by simply holding these side by side, I can tell how long this cut needs to be. And using the other side of the knife, the tapered side now down, I slice this off until I get the same width as my scion wood. Okay, I've got that. Again, I find center. I go back just a little bit. I make that tongue cut. And slide them together. The tongue cut is really there to keep those two hanging on to each other until I get the wrapper on. How's that? So again, it's a nice tight fit. The only difference is I have this stump end. We'll be able to cover that with the wrapping tape. It's called budding tape, but we use it in the summer for bud grafting. So again, stretch this out and trap the first tail of it and keep wrapping, pulling it tight, stretching out the wrapper. Oh, I tore it a little bit, but then I'm going back down over myself and then break it off. This kind of seals up the end of that stump, and there you go. You have a side graft tree as well as the whip and tongue. Okay.
All right. So that is the overview of how to graft. And it is now time for our Q&A. I know we have a couple questions already coming in the chat, and I will make sure to ask those. So thank you for all of that information. It's fun to see in the chat, someone mentioned that they already have fully blooming trees, and then we hear from people all across the states talking about the different stages of greening and budding and blossoming, and it's fun to see all of that. Makes me happy to think of that happening everywhere. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat and I will read them aloud to Lindsay and he'll answer. If you'd rather ask them yourself, you can raise your hand virtually and I'll see that and can call on you. Let's see. So Lindsay, the first two questions are kind of broad questions to make sure that people understand. Can you tell us what is this kind of grafting called?
Okay, we generally refer to it as bench grafting, and that's simply that you can do it sitting here at a table. It would have been done in the nursery trade during the late winter. And there are other forms of grafting, like bud grafting that's done in the summer with rootstocks that have been planted in the ground. And there's also top working that would be done this time of year, but outdoors. But bench grafting is something you do, you know, sitting in a chair or on a stool and working at a table. The whip and tongue or the side graft are really the names of the technique you're using.
Right. And then we have a number of questions about the rootstock. Can you tell us what kind of rootstock this is and why we chose that? And then also talk about if people want to source their own rootstock, how they would go about doing so.
Okay. What you got in your kit is called M7. And M7 is a 50% size of standard. If I planted a apple seed and grew a tree from seed, it would be what we call a standard size tree, and that would grow to be roughly 40 feet tall, maybe more, maybe less, just like any genetic life form on the planet. There's variation. And so this is why we can't say that this M7 will grow a 12-foot tree with one variety. I've got two varieties here. They might grow different heights. So we say it in terms of percentages. This one grows a tree that's about 50% the size of standard, oftentimes being in the 12-foot neighborhood. It is also probably the smallest tree, smallest mature tree that is considered self-supporting, meaning the root system's big enough and vigorous enough to hold the tree up through its lifespan. We get smaller than that. There's a lot of choices in rootstock that produces a smaller tree, but they all tend to need support, either a fence, a post, something like that. So it's just a good all-round, very hardy variety that that we like to use here. There are literally hundreds of varieties out there, and it's really easy to find information on them. There are nurseries. There's some huge wholesale nurseries. Most of these trees are grown out in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington. I think there's a few that might be grown out in New York State, but mostly the Pacific Northwest because they have a longer, wetter growing season. And there are retail nurseries if you want 10 trees, 10 roots. There are retail nurseries that can supply those. My rule of thumb is to order early because some of the best varieties tend to sell out quickly. There are wholesale nurseries that won't deal with an order of 10. They bundle these in bundles of 50 or so. And unless you're talking about 100 or a few hundred trees, they're not interested. If you're talking about 100 trees or more, by all means. And what happens here locally, some of our fruit growing friends go together and put an order in for 100 or a couple hundred trees and then split them up. The price, the more you order, the price goes down quite considerably.
Yeah. Someone's asking if there's a way to raise your own rootstock. Is there a DIY option if you don't want to go to nurseries?
I've done this myself. I'm getting into my packet. If you look at your root, there's a stump end. There's a flat cut on this. Basically, this was grown in a stool block, meaning, well, let me ask you this. Have you ever cut off a box elder tree or any weed tree and then it sprouts and it grows back? Well, they're using that technique to create an apple stool block. So this is a known variety, and they cut it off close to the ground, and these shoots come up. Well, when the shoots get 10, 12 inches tall, they mound a growing medium. In the big scale commercial, it's usually like composted sawdust or something. And they mound that up around the base of this stump with all these shoots on it. And these trees then grow roots out into that medium. And at the end of the growing season, they run through with a cutter and just slice them all off below that mound of growing medium. And voila, they have hundreds and well, some of these places produce them by the millions. So it's basically cloning one plant. And I've done it with a single plant. Plant this one out, grow it 2 years so it gets well established, and cut it off at 2 inches. It's going to branch, and when those branches are 12 inches tall, mound some compost around them or some potting mix, and by the end of the season, these shoots will have rooted into this, and you can dig down in there and cut them off. So I worked, when I first learned grafting, I worked for a wholesale nursery, and we were growing a lot of crab apples, ornamental crab apples, and those we put on a seedling. So if you want a standard tree, you can just graft them onto a homegrown seedling. Though there is also a variety called Antonovka that's in the trade that is grown often from seed or school block production, but it grows a very good and incredibly hardy rootstock.
Right. So someone wrote in, we accidentally sent a couple people rootstock without having that ordered. So apologies, or you're welcome to whoever that happened. But they don't have the scion to go with it. So they're wondering if they can plant it this year and use it next year.
Certainly. All you have to do is, for a year, protect it from the rodents, the meadow voles and rabbits. But I have planted excess scion wood and dug it up next year. It's going to be a little thicker, a little bit bigger diameter next year, which is harder cutting, but it could make a very good tree. So yes, that's entirely possible. I noticed some chat about people living in areas where the trees are already flowering. But I want to point out, if you go look at the tree closely, the flowers come out first, and then the leaves start coming out. And if you can often go to a tree that's leafed out or flowering, and in the center, those water shoots are still not very leafed out. And if you go down the water, the tip of it leaves out first, and you go down the stem a ways, these might not be leafed out yet. We're in zone 4A here. I have grafted trees as late as May 1st. Now that puts me a little behind, if I have 2 weeks of storage and healing before I plant it out, that puts me a little behind, but it can be done. So I would look around and see if you can find any scion wood that's not leafed out yet. If it has leafed out, I think you're better off waiting.
Great. Someone's asking about soils and rootstock. The specific question here is, will M7 work in a certain kind of soil? But can you just talk about the relationship, or if there is a relationship between the kind of soil you're working in and the kind of rootstock you choose?
Right. In general, all apple trees like a fertile and well-drained soil, meaning you don't want to put them in a place that tends to puddle up. Though if you read all the descriptions of all the many varieties of rootstocks available, some of them are better suited for lighter soils like gravelly, sandy soils than others. Here we have really fine clay soils, fine particle clay soils, and they almost all do well here, partly because we're not too far down. We have this limestone that's like a sponge, and it sucks all our moisture away fairly quickly. That's the biggest thing, is that they don't want to be in wet spots. I mean, they need even moisture. They don't like drying out, but other than that, I can't discuss it too much in detail.
We have quite a few questions asking about different varieties of fruit trees. Does apple need to be with apple rootstock, and can you graft other kinds of fruit trees onto apple rootstock?
This is a perennial question, and it's understandable. No, apples, the genus name is Malus, and so Malus has to go on a Malus. A pear almost always has to go on a pear. Stone fruit, Prunus, the genus Prunus includes peaches and cherries and plums. All go on a prunus root. And grafting is certainly done with some of the nut species. So a walnut has to go on a walnut and so on. So you can't do intergenetic splicing. Was that it? Was that the gist of it?
Yeah, thanks. And related question, is it the same process? You have to use the correct match, but is it the same process for other fruit trees?
It's mostly the same process. I did mention nut trees, and they'll have a thicker bark, so it's quite a different process. But still the same thing.
Great. It looks like Randy has a hand up. Randy, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I kind of have a couple questions. If it's too much, that's fine. But first question is, well, I just want to first say that this is my third year doing this. I grafted 12 trees. One is the only one that was unsuccessful. So I have a ton of apple trees, and the reason why it failed is because I grafted the scion wood upside down. So one thing is I've always learned from these instructionals that you typically use whip and tongue if the diameter of the scion wood and the rootstock is similar. But I've seen other techniques like the cleft graft, and it seems like it might be easier. I haven't tried it, but what is your take on that? Because it seems like that has to be of the same diameter also.
Yes. Cleft graft is basically when you're splitting the end of the rootstock, and your scion wood, correct me if I'm wrong from what you understand, but your scion wood would be tapered on both sides.
Right. Yep.
And that then is stuck in the end of a rootstock that has been split. Yes, it's very important that the cambium layers have to match, and however you get them to match, if they match well and you pull them tight together and have the same good healing process, yeah,
I just thought that it might give you a better chance. I've had really good success with the whip and tongue graft, but it just seems like having two sides that have the potential to graft to the scion or to the rootstock would be give you a better chance of the graft being successful overall, because there's two different sides have the option, right?
I know the only thing I've done cleft grafting on was one time I did some spruce trees. They were selected variety, bright silver Colorado spruce trees. And we used a cleft graft there, partly because we left a living piece of the rootstock on as a nurse, so the plant still continued to grow. Anyway, I think it's a personal preference. I think I've probably not used it much. When you split the top of the rootstock, anytime you split the grain like that, it has a tendency to run down the tree a little farther. It's very important to really tie that up tight so it comes back together. And ultimately, it's just an equation of how much airspace is in between your graft union. And the less space in there for the callus tissue that's going to form during healing, the less space there is to fill in, the quicker they'll join.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
I brought along some large scale examples today, so that it'd be a little easier to explain some of this, but when what we're gonna do is try to make a joint that is really, really tightly fitting. And the less, and holding this up, I can see a little bit of light through there. Well, it'd be impossible to get it so there wasn't. But when we pull that together, these have, in the healing time, these have to fill in with callus tissue to the extent that there's no air left in there. It's not until that time that the cell structure, the cells will differentiate and form vascules, and then you've got a tree that is one. It's no longer two separate parts. So the cleaner these cuts, the more accurate they are, and the closer this fit, the quicker the healing process happens. I brought along a little. Okay, here's my cut in. I've got a green highlighter. I can see on this piece the cambium layer, but I'm just gonna draw it in highlighted. You'll be able to see them on yours too, but right inside the bark, I've highlighted this bright green, and that represents my cambium layer. Well, when grafting, I need to connect the two cambium layers just right on top of each other. That is what works. And the callus tissue, it's like when you cut a limb, the callus forms around the cut end. This is the process. I almost think of it, you can buy those cans of foam to seal cracks in the house. Imagine the callus tissue as that expandable foam, and it'll fill that joint up with callus, and that will then create, let the tree grow together, become a single unit.
So I guess there is more of a potential for error if you don't, in a cleft graft, if you don't make sure that it's wrapped up tight and that there's no airspace. So I guess that would be the difference.
I think we're splitting hairs here. I think that
Okay.
either one will work. They're both tried and true methods. So if I would say, try the cleft if you'd like. It's an accepted method.
Okay, so one more question really quick is I've seen people take on rooted and grafted and growing apple trees, take a cylindrical removal of the bark and cambium layer, and then place rooting medium in between that on the tree in a wrapped up container, and then it root, and then they would cut it off there. Now that's like removing the rootstock from the equation, isn't it? It seems like
Right.
if you just planted that.
That would be what's a technique called layering. It's often used on houseplants. And it could be used on an apple. It's not going to be as successful, I think, as grafting. Grafting is so commonly used in the nursery trade, and there's a reason for it. It's pretty reliable. You can take cuttings of this new growth and stick them in the soil, and some will root. In either of these situations, you're having a tree grow on what we call on its own root. So you don't have any control over the size based on an added root system, which is fine if you want a full-grown tree. Even if you have a grafted tree and you plant it too deep so that the graft union is in the soil, the scion wood then is going to root out, and it's going to negate your dwarfing root system. This has happened here quite a bit, actually. So this is why I'm not afraid to plant 8-10 inches up the stem, because I don't want that root, that graft union anywhere near the soil. But I have bud grafted trees for years, which is something you do in the summertime, and had my you put that graft on in late August around here and let them grow the rest of the year. That bud stays dormant till the next spring. And the next spring I go through and cut the tops off. And to keep the tag in place, I leave the tag on this piece I cut off and stick it in the ground. Well, a number of those will root, meaning you could do this by rooted cutting, meaning I could collect 100 8-inch cuttings. I might treat them with a little rooting hormone and stick them in the ground, a week before your frost-free date. Some of those are going to grow. Well, that's not a lot of work to get a few trees, but they're going to be on their own root system.
Thanks.
Great, thanks for all of those questions. Lindsay, a couple of follow-ups. Could you define what you mean by cambium layer and why that's what we want to join together?
All right, the cambium layer. One of my bigger pieces. Cambium, there's the bark, this dark stuff on the outside. This is the wood in the middle, and it's got vast veins in it. That
Lindsay, can you raise that up a little bit? You're not, there you
Thank
go.
you, thank you.
Thanks.
But right inside the bark is this little green layer. That's the cambium, and that's really the growing part of the tree. It produces, those cells divide readily, and it produces both the bark tissue and the wood. And that's, it's kind of like the stem cell of the tree. It's cell structure that changes purpose readily. And that is where the callus is going to grow from. So when I make a graft union, I put these together, I want those to line up. I want them pressed right against each other. Okay.
Great.
Again, back to this one, I drew that fake cambium in there, so it's kind of bright, but it's there on both sides of this, and that should match. I made a couple that are common errors. Oh, that just looks, this one, I cut it so that the top of this is kind of domed. And I put this on, and I cannot make the cambium layers touch each other because there's a little dome. That's a really bad image. There's a dome to this, so the cambium layers are down on the sides. This one has that tail, and usually what happens with that is that tail's sticking up, laying up on top of bark, and that's not going to do it any good. Luckily, the tail is really easy to just put a little more thumb pressure on there and take it off. Okay, but this is probably the most common first mistake, is to not put enough thumb pressure behind that, and you end up with that tail. One other set of examples I brought are cuts that are too steep. Okay. Now, when we rubber these, when we band them together, the pressure is toward the center of the stem, it's inward. And if we put pressure there, look, they slide it. We want them along gentle taper, where's the right one? So that when we squeeze them, they pull together. They don't slide apart. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. I want to address one other thing that both came in the question and in Randy's comment. If you graft these with the buds pointing down, they won't grow. So how do you know what direction the buds should go as you're grafting?
The bud is triangular in shape, and there's a little point, and that points up. You can also look at this stick. One end's fatter than the other. This is the tip, You want that tip's got to be up. Now I know you're going to cut that off, but the fat end is where you want to start because it's probably the one that's going to be most likely to match the diameter of your rootstock. When you're making these cuts, I really want from this direction, I want to see a nice rounded end. And I want to see that cambium and bark all the way around that. Okay, if I've done it, where'd my papers go? Here's something that often occurs. Somebody makes the cut and there's a square end still. Well, that means that cambium layer here is out on the back side. We need to put enough pressure behind there so we get a nice rounded end on that. This cut should really make an elliptical shape. It should be flat this way. It should be flat this way.
You mentioned that, well, the question here is, why do you need to even graft at all if you can start a branch in the soil?
You're just upping your chances. Like I said, I'm guessing, but if you stuck 100 cuttings, you might get 10. I don't know, you might get 50 if you're really lucky. And that's still a lot of trees. And they're on the same root. So mostly we graft so we can determine the size of the tree. The orchard industry right now is just as fast as they can switching over to super dwarf trees. The old standard, the rule of thumb for standard trees was always to plant them 40 feet apart. That gave, this is with standards, they're big trees. They're what I call a shade tree with fruit. And they 40 feet apart, both directions will give you 40 trees per acre. Well, modern orcharding is putting 1,500 trees in an acre because they're growing on smaller and smaller stuff, and they're growing them in tight rows on fences. So it basically becomes a wall of fruit, a wall of fruit producing wood, and they it's called high density orcharding, and it's all the rage right now. They're easier to maintain, they're more efficient to maintain, and I think it's got a lot of useful application, especially if I've got a smaller yard. I have a lot of land on my farm, but I'm increasingly interested in growing the dwarfs on a fence so that they're just right there around my patio.
Nice. Judy, I think you had your hand up a couple minutes ago. Do you still have a question you want to ask?
Yes, I do. Thank you. My question, you mentioned top working, and it sounds like grafting, but not at a bench, but outdoors. Can you say how would that differ from the bench grafting, if other than location, like what time of year, what materials
Okay,
do it?
good. It really could be another class, but quickly. Say I've got a tree that's growing in my orchard, but I don't know what it is, or I'm not interested in that variety anymore. Commercial orchards do this quite often. A friend of mine that has a pretty good sized orchard just did it to probably a quarter of his trees. And this will work on a tree this is only barely an inch, but it could work on a 5-inch tree. Probably could work on a bigger tree, but you basically cut the tree off. So I've got a stump. You only want to do this on a root and trunk that are in good shape. And what I do is I simply take a knife and I make a vertical slit. got a bud grafting blade here. I'm gonna stand up, I guess. And where'd that go? There it is. Ooh. This bark is not wanting to slip. Anyway, I open a little pocket in the side of the bark here. Now I'm gonna go up here. And so usually when doing this, I make a slit in here. I've made a little tool for this. Well, there maybe it's. And I can open a little pocket and then slide. See, here's the sign would cut just like we're doing it now, and I can slide it in under the bark. Now I still wrap that up. The difference is it's outdoors, so I take grafting wax, I melt it, and I let it cool back down to where it's almost solid again, and then I dope this all up, seal it, and that'll heal and grow. Now, if on a bigger stem than this, I might put three of them around it. So it's really pretty fascinating stuff. Because you literally, if you've got an established rootstock, you cut that off, you put new variety on it. You've got this rootstock pushing all this growth, and usually those types of things will produce fruit again in 2 years, 3 at the most. So it's really kind of a quick changeover for fruit varieties for an orchardist. Say he's found that his Macintosh just don't sell anymore, and he wants to grow. Here we go. This variety is Iowa Snow. He wants to grow Iowa Snow again. Who knows? Anyway, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. I love this question. Can I plant apples from seeds, cull the weak ones, and then plan to use the in situ rootstock for grafting onto?
You can grow apples from seed. Seed grown apples, actually, you can grow them from seed and have an orchard. Johnny Appleseed did just that. And therefore, we have this rich apple heritage. So you grow 1,000 trees out and grow, and 50 of them look good. You save those. And you could have new varieties to share or use. I'm not quite, I think you could. I'm not quite sure where grafting would come into that, unless you wanted them on a smaller stature tree. So if you grew them out from seed and decided that was a good variety, you could graft that onto a smaller rootstock and then have a 10-12 foot tree if you wanted that. Something I've always been tempted to do is to grow a seedling orchard. I might be a little old for this, but to grow a seedling orchard, because I make hard cider with a lot of my juice. So I think the early American hard ciders were just that. They were made from seedling grown trees. And I think that it would be fascinating to do that and see what we get. There's a few places around here locally that have pastures that are full of wild apples. And it's a fascinating experiment that the horses have conducted, that we have all these varieties that are unnamed, just seedling grown varieties, and many of them are good. Many of them won't be in a seed grown population. There's a proverb that says in every apple there's an orchard. There's 5 seeds in each apple, and each one of those is going to produce a different type of tree, because it's gone through the sexual propagation in the seed generation. So all the seeds in any one given apple would grow different trees because they've been pollinated from this tree and that tree, and you know, there's no control over where the pollen came from.
Right, thank you. We have a couple of questions about grafting and planting into a container. Can you plant into a container temporarily? If so, how long? Including if someone's moving in a year, or if it needs to be in the ground that whole time.
Okay, very good. Another perennial question. I always say suggest not to, but that's precisely because I've done it. And one thing, if I was going to move in a year, I'd still plant it in the ground and dig it up and move it when I moved, providing I could do that in a dormant period, either spring or fall. I ran a nursery for my whole career, and we grew, you know, thousands, tens of thousands of plants in pots. And I just am intimately familiar with the responsibility that comes with having a tree in a pot. So I'm just saying, if you put it in a 2-gallon pot for the summer, that thing's gonna need water every other day. And you miss a few days and you lose a tree. So I think that it can be done. I don't think you'll get near the growth rate that you would have in the soil. Now that said, I'll tell a story. A friend of mine was playing around with Asian pears, and he had extras, and he gave me his really crooked ones. And being a nurseryman, he also told me they weren't very hardy here. And so I didn't want to plant them in the ground. I put them in pots, and they did pretty well, and they started producing fruit in a year or so. And I kept them, and I put them just in kind of on the edge of the patio every summer, and watered them every morning when I got up. And time goes by, and they got big, and I moved them to bigger and bigger pots. And I would simply put them in my root cellar over winter for storage. So a place that wouldn't get so severely cold as it would if it was out. And we can go to 20 below here, and that would kill a tree in a pot. So I would put them in the root cellar for the winter, drag them out in the spring when they started blooming. And I had those trees for 25 years, and they grew quite large. They looked like a big wide bonsai structure. Each tree, I would thin them heavily. They'd set fruit heavily, and I'd thin them aggressively, and I would get 2 dozen nice fruit out of each one. But that said, you know, if I went away for a few days, I'd have to have my neighbor come water them, and it's just a lot of work. So I'm saying it can be done, but in my experience, I'm going to look for another way.
Yeah, thank you. We have a number of questions left. I do want to let people know that this session ends at 10:30. We will be recording this. We will be sharing this with you. If there are questions that we haven't gotten to, go ahead and still continue to add questions here. I will collect those. If we need to, we can create a document and share that via email as well. Lindsay, we have a number of questions about grafting onto existing trees. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that. Some people are talking about these fruit cocktail trees where you have different varieties on the same tree. And some people are asking, not necessarily about different varieties, but can you graft onto something that's already growing?
Yes, and yeah, a friend of mine has done it. Actually, when we first grafted the Seed Savers collection, we had a collection down in the collector down in the Chicago area who had a single tree in his backyard, and he had 30 or more varieties on it. The best way to do that is to find a small diameter stem, just like what we're working with today with these rootstocks, and then find some cyan wood that matches it and do the same type of graft. The timing on that is critical because it's outdoors. just like the top working, if we do it too early and we go down to 10, 15 degrees, we could damage it. If we do it too late, they're gonna want to grow before they've had time to heal. So here's the marker is when the first dandelions bloom to do this, like right, and that's almost right now for us. So when you see a few dandelions bloom, get out and do this. But find some nice small diameter stems and graft onto those. And mostly I'm going to look for these back in the middle of the tree or near the center. Because if you graft them way out on the tips, then you're going to have a new variety out on the tip. And in pruning a tree, we keep cutting the tips back, and it's just better to have it initiating back toward the center of the tree. If you one way you can, give yourself a little more leeway in doing that is to somehow insulate the graft union when you make it. You're outside, it's exposed to the elements. So I have in the past used padded mailing envelopes to make a little pouch to put around those graft unions for a few days to a few weeks even, to give them a little insulated space to exist in while they're trying to heal before then we ask them to grow. Or anything. I mean, the old school, they used to pack sphagnum around, stuff like that, and wrap it up with twine so that it was a little insulated. So.
Great. Candace, it looks like you have your hand raised. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. So my question is, I have property that has all kinds of wild cherries on it. Like they're crazy prolific. Could I graft, say, a Royal Anne or a Bing or something like that onto wild cherry stock?
I believe you could.
Okay, because it's the same genus, right?
Yeah, they're a prunus, so yes, that would work. I have never grafted a stone fruit of any kind myself, so but it stands to reason. I would look for a nice young one so that you're not dealing with old wood down there when you do your grafting.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. And I just put in the chat, I think you could use those pipe insulators around your graft, the foam ones you wrap around a pipe.
Sure.
Wouldn't that should work really well for insulating a graft cut? So just a thought. Thank you for that answer.
Thanks, Candace. Lindsay, what kind of success rate would you estimate for grafting, both for beginners and expert, for bench grafting, and how does that compare to other kinds of grafting?
Right. Well, I want to give everybody the full dose of confidence in what we're going to do here, and that, and I have to say, from the feedback we get, we find a lot of people are successful with these grafts. And we just heard from somebody today that has joined us for 3 years and lost one. And when I'm doing these grafts, I think Jamie can correct me if we're wrong. I think we were in the high 90s last year, and doing hundreds and hundreds of trees. So this is the nice thing about bench grafting, is it is a very highly successful method. Bud grafting is less successful, but it takes a lot less time per tree. So, commercially, a lot of nurseries use bud grafting because it's quicker. But I feel confident in saying you're all going to have, you're all going to have pretty darn good luck, especially if you make accurate connections. I'm going to add to that. We work with you through this thing. We have subsequent sessions scheduled throughout the process. So it's not over when you graft that tree today, it is started. So after grafting today, there's the healing time that it spends in cool, moist conditions. There's the planting day. And we ask you to come back and join us for that, because at every one of these little processes, you can lose your tree, you know. So, and all the way through to this fall, we'll join up again if you want and show you how to protect them for the winter. Everybody out there wants to eat your young fruit trees. So you can do all this work and pretty early in the winter have them eaten, and it's a big waste of time, except that you've learned something. But if you follow all these steps accurately, I think you'll be fully successful.
Right. One important question that's come through is about the knife, and how often do you have to sharpen it? What do we need to know about this knife, and how that can help determine the success of grafting?
Good. A grafting knife is what's called chisel sharpened. Let me explain that. I have a chisel here. Stand up. See how a chisel is flat on one side and beveled on the other. So that's the same way this blade is. And it's not going to show up on this image, but if you look at yours, it's got a flat side and a beveled side. That flat side is important in that we're trying to make a flat cut, an even plane. And so if I try doing that with the beveled side, I end up cupping it. Okay, and then that's going to be hard to make the connection with the other side. But with the flat side, I can pull it through there and get a really nice flat cut. Sharpening. I just did several hundred trees for our orchard here. I've got a little arthritis in my hand, so I was doing 50 a day to try to not overdo it. And I would basically sharpen up 2 knives to get me through that session. So I guess that's saying every time I did 25 trees or 50 cuts, I was sharpening. So it's sharp enough today, comes pretty sharp from the factory, sharp enough today to do all the grafts you're going to do today. More than anything, I just touch it up on a strop, which is a piece of leather with jeweler's rouge or honing compound on it. And that's just a matter of dragging it back and forth on there to keep the edge, rather than, if you ever go so far as to lose the edge and need to regrind it, then you've got a lot of work to do. But if every time you do 10 trees, you turn to the side and strop it, you're gonna just keep it sharp. And it should be sharp enough to shave with. That makes it a lot easier work. When I pick up a newly sharpened knife, I really should put this thumb cup back on so I don't draw blood in front of everybody. But when I pick up a new one, I'm so much more likely to get a good cut in 1 or 2 strokes, and that increases your speed. If you're doing it for a living, you really want to not waste a lot of time on whittling.
Yeah, thank you. And for those of you who purchased a knife from us, you noticed that we had a right-handed or left-handed knife as options. Lindsay, can you describe what the difference is between what someone using their right hand needs versus using their left hand?
The way we teach it is to hold that flat side toward your body, put your thumb on it, then put the wood in between the thumb and knife blade. Now I don't have a left-handed knife here, but I'll move this thumb cut over and imagine, I mean, it's the same motion. You can tell I'm not very practiced that way. And because I'm cutting with that beveled side toward me, I'm getting huge tails on these. Because it's really hard to finish that cut with that bevel toward you. Same thing is if you're afraid of this system and you try this, you know, you've got no support behind that. So there's no way to make that cut without having these tails on it. But with the thumb supporting the back of the wood and the thumb only moving up against the blade like that, and you move the wood, not the knife, this is very safe. And because my arm is attached to my body, it takes less muscle. Okay.
Great. How do you feel about the grafting plier type cutters that cut a puzzle shape?
Okay, I'm gonna say one thing about this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I've had people in the past not realize these are perforated and they come apart. So there's about 2 inches in each piece, and now that's enough to do a tree. Okay, what was that question?
Talking about the plier cutters that are puzzle
Oh,
shaped.
Yes, we own one here at Seed Savers. But here's the deal. If the blade is this, some of you might not be familiar. There's this thing that's a big plier, and you put the wood in it and you clamp it. And it cuts a finger joint. You know, it cuts a joint shaped like this. So they're weird little zigzag blades in there. If those aren't really sharp, meaning brand new blades, they tend to tear everything up. So my problem with them is that you can't sharpen them. You got to just keep putting new blades in them. And if I'm going to do a day's work, I'm going to need at least 2, if not 3 blades, I think. And it seems simpler to me to make a nice clean cut with a knife, and I can sharpen that knife. I can use this knife the rest of my life for grafting. I have one old knife at home that I used 30 years ago that is a little worn thin, but I can still use it. But this is the mechanical systems to me are just, I could see using that in a really high production commercial model, but I would, again, I'd have a whole crate of blades sitting there ready to replace every time it started ripping the bark off. So we have one here, we just don't use it.
Right. Talking about the knife sharpening, someone's saying they're looking up straps online and see that some are on blocks and some are straps. Is one type best for honing grafting knives?
The block is pretty good. You'll find them in wood carving supply places. A lot of it is glued to a block, and that's fine. Those would work. They're probably more accurate, and when you can set the block on the table, you have a little easier time controlling the angle. Of course, the flat side, you're gonna put it right flat on that and drag it away from the cutting edge, and then the beveled side, you're gonna put an angle on it and drag it. It's something, it's one of those nuanced things. You need to just do a bunch of it to get the feel for it. I'm sure there's sharpening videos online if you want to dive into that one. I also have a set of just small, like they're 6 inches long diamond hones that are in different grades, and those are very useful too. If you're going to do a lot of this, you're going to want to be really good at sharpening.
Great. We have 6 more minutes, and it looks like I have 3 questions. If I've missed your question somehow, feel free to email me. If your question is about tree care or planting the tree, anything like that, we'll go over that tomorrow morning. So please bring those questions to tomorrow's session. Lindsay, is it true that smaller trees don't live as long?
Yes.
And do you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's too simple an answer for me.
It was the shortest answer I've ever heard from you, but I thought you were done.
A friend of ours just gave us a little talk on pears. He showed a pear tree that was 300 years old that still had a lot of, it was in bloom, and it was this big, huge trunk that had little branches on it. And it basically, somebody who knew what they were doing was pruning that. And you know, fruit trees produce best fruit on 2, 3, and 4-year-old wood. And the tree is really, the production part of the tree is only as old as its 2, 3, and 4-year-old wood. So every now and then you can cut limbs back, force, these are called renewal cuts, cut them back, force new growth. That in 2 years is going to start producing wood or fruit. But anyway, you can have a 300-year-old tree. Pears are more alive. I'm talking about, they're replacing them in 10 years, but then they're looking for max production and stuff like that. So 10, 15 years on a really super dwarf. 60 to 100 years on a standard. Was that all there was to that one?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions here about the scion and rootstock. Do they need to be, sorry, I read that wrong. Do we need to worry about the hardiness of the scion if the rootstock is fine for the zone? And also, what traits come from the rootstock versus what traits come from the scion?
Okay, very good. The rootstock, the biggest thing we look for in a rootstock is the size control. So they're going to be listed as super dwarfs, semi-dwarfs, standards, and everything in between. There are other qualities imparted by the rootstock. Some of them, if you read about them, will have resistance to things like woolly aphid that it lends to the tree. There's quite a number of things that that some rootstocks, resistance to fire, but fire blight, for example, some rootstocks are highly recommended for that. If you live in an area where there's a lot of fruit production and there's fire blight around, you might be looking for some of those. The hardiness, it's really, as far as hardiness, it's really all about the root being able to survive the ultimate low temperatures in the wintertime. And you know, I have friends that are growing fruit trees north of Lake Superior, you know, way up in zone 3, and apples seem to do fine there if they can deal with 160 inches of snow load. So it's the root zone. Realize the it's very different. You know, we can have 40 below air temperatures, but you go 12 inches into the soil and it might be 15 degrees. So it's that temperature that determines if a tree is going to live or die, and whether a tree can live in zone 3 or 4 or 8. It's that root zone temperature. So when we say that a rootstock variety is hardy, like we do with Antonovka and Bud 9 and this M7 are all considered quite hardy. I don't think it matters what variety we put on it, except that there are some varieties of apples known as southern varieties. The big difference with those is that every apple tree has a minimum chilling requirement to produce flowers. So if I have this tree planted in South Texas and we only see frost 3 nights a year, well, that's not enough chilling for this tree to bloom. So southern varieties have lower chilling requirements required for bloom, whereas something like a Duchess of Oldenburg could probably bloom. It's not a southern variety, it's a northern variety. It came brought here pretty much from Siberia, and it's incredibly hardy and could tolerate extremely low temperatures. Anyway, that's kind of rambling on about that. I'm very willing to try just about anything as far as any cyan variety as far north as the root would go.
Great, thank you so much. We are at 10:30. If you have questions that we didn't get to that are about the actual physical grafting or the rootstock and scion that we sent out, please feel free to email me. If you have questions about how to care for your tree, make sure you come to tomorrow morning's session and bring those questions there. So thanks all for being here. Thank you for all of your great questions. We'll see some of you later today for your knife coaching sessions, and some of you later tomorrow for your knife coaching sessions. Hopefully we will see you all tomorrow at the same time when we talk about how to care for these newly grafted trees. Lindsay, thank you so much for all of your time and expertise, and we will see you all soon.